You're breathtaking. You're all breathtaking. All right. So, I got something.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Fernando Comics. As usual, I am your host, Fernando. I had been meaning to make this video for a long time, but I kept finding reasons to push it back. But now that War of the Realms is concluded, I believe that Jason Aaron has pretty much done everything he can do to mainstream Thor, so I'm able to fairly judge his work without getting blindsided by future works, possibly introducing some new elements to the story or whatnot. You see, I've been critiquing Jason Aaron's work on Thor for a long time now. October 1st, 2014 is when Aaron released his new Thor #1, with Jane Foster as the lead protagonist. It took until June 25th, 2019 for Thor to finally be restored to a respected status. Or I hope he's been restored at least. So, for those of you who endured the 5 years of butchering, consider yourselves my brothers in arms. It hasn't been easy for anyone. In this video, I'm going to actually go over point by point why the material presented after October 1st, 2014 by Jason Aaron was destructive and disrespectful towards Thor and his fans, and how it permanently damaged his legacy as a character. I get a lot of comments from people saying things similar to, hey, every character has his ups and downs, Thor will get back to normal eventually. Or, Aaron had a great story, it's just not what we're used to, but it's good for character growth. Listen, I know these comments mean well, but they're not just opinions. They work against what we're trying to do here. I'm sorry, I know I'm going to rub people the wrong way in this video, but these things need to be said. First though, I want to say that I'm going to try to avoid Odin as much as possible in this video, because that deserves its own separate video. And he is unfortunately such a huge part of these stories that he will inevitably pop up in some parts. It just won't be my main focus. So let's get into this. Why Jason Aaron permanently damaged Thor. But first, a little history. November 14th, 2012 is when Aaron took the mantle as Thor's new writer and started writing with God of Thunder #1. Man, was it a welcome sight for Thor fans. You see, Thor had just been through some of the worst ass beatings he'd ever experienced in 2012. If you guys all remember, this was the year of Avengers vs. X-Men, and it brought a screeching halt to the promises of the heroic age. Thor was beaten and humiliated for about a year straight, a little more, by a lot of characters, and quite a few of which should not have been able to do so, at least not the way that they did. Within his own main title, written by Matt Fraction at the time, called The Mighty Thor, he was doing well. He was absurdly powerful, and the feats he acquired I still use to this day, like killing the Demigorge, bashing in Galactus's head, vaporizing super enhanced Ulick, beating both enhanced Hulk and the Thing, etc, etc. Feats wise, he was in good shape. He was also a raging psychotic moron though, and we were all really hoping for a new Thor writer sooner than later. Matt Fraction was also responsible for the beginning of the end for Odin's character, but that is another topic, as I mentioned. Then appears Jason Aaron, with a shiny new Thor costume and storyline. Man, was it a good time. It was fun, it was new. Thor was respected within his own run and outside of it too. His dialogue was new, but it was good. There was general happiness for the Thor community. Those were some good 2-ish years we had. Thor's stock rose tremendously, and I could legitimately argue in his favor against the likes of characters like Superman, who was also doing quite well. But only Thor was the one breaking planets as a side effect of his fight. We were in a good spot. And to think that was half a decade ago, Sometime later, there came previews for a new event called Original Sin. At this time, Marvel was still rolling on the event train, and this didn't really strike anyone as anything special. It was just another Marvel event. So we start seeing these teaser images, like the ones on screen, showing an unworthy Thor and a female Thor, which we now know is Jane Thor. So Thor was going to be unworthy, but not just unworthy. He was going to be forced into being unworthy, because the previews did read about this wasn't something Thor could control. He was getting taken out, and Original Sin did prove that when we saw Nick Fury whisper into Thor and the hammer dropped. My first thoughts were interesting concept. The truth is that Thor had become very hammer dependent. He had a lot of feats, but a very few of those were feats without Mjolnir, and it had been a long time desire now for the Thor community that Thor should be shown as what he was without the hammer. He had Hulk level strength, he was an excellent martial artist, and he had the ability to bring down the elements. His lightning was massively powerful, and he didn't need the hammer to do that. I'll admit it, I was pretty excited, especially because it was Jason Aaron. If it had been someone else, I probably wouldn't have trusted them to do it right, but I think we had seen that Jason had proven himself. And the female worthy user, I don't think that had ever been done before. There were a lot of goddesses and even earthly heroes who could be good candidates for the hammer. I mean, don't get me wrong, I would have preferred the hammer to stay stationary until Thor was able to get his worthiness back and go back and get it. But this wasn't the worst idea to me. It was fine. There was Sif, Valkyrie, Freya. They were all good potential candidates. They were all powerful goddesses with years of experience leading and fighting the odds across the universe. Or for the mortals, Solomon Roz seemed to be getting built up to this potential role by Aaron. She seemed to fit the role well. Or Storm would have been an excellent choice because she already resembled a storm goddess. Maybe even Scarlet Witch, if you're trying to be adventurous, that would have been a cool storyline. But you see, Jason didn't pick any of these fine heroes. He picked Jane Foster. Jane Foster is a nurse, with no fighting experience and no connection to Norse lore other than she was a love interest of Thor. And not even his greatest love interest, she was arguably more so meant for Donald Blake and was forgotten for years at a time without mention. She was not a leader, she was never particularly special in any regard, and yet she was chosen by the hammer. Why? Well, let's talk about that. The hammer actually comes out and tells us why I picked her. As you can read on screen, she had a good heart. Let's roll the list of heroes with a good heart who have failed to lift the hammer. That is not enough. It has never been enough to be worthy. Did Thor stop having a good heart when he became unworthy? Obviously not. But I was willing to give some leeway, because after all, Jane wasn't the first mortal to pick up the hammer, and the worthy conditions have never been spelled out exactly as they are. Well, then I think it's fair to give her the benefit of the doubt. Erik Masterson, Jake Olsen, etc. None of them particularly had anything out of the ordinary and could be Jane Fosters of their own. If this had been the end of the problems, this would be a very short video and we could have dismissed it as a difference in opinions. This, however, leads me to a main point. The story of Thor has been going on for over 50 years, 56 I believe, at the time that I'm speaking. There have been many stories told and lore that has been established before Jason took the mantle of Thor's writer. Jason does not give a flying fuck about lore. He changed it on a whim and made sure that you'd accept it. It led to a lot of little details getting pushed away hard so that Jason could write his story. For instance, it's fairly common knowledge that Mjolnir is bound to Thor's life, so that if Mjolnir was broken, so too did Thor die. JMS wrote this, and Aaron had to have read it, so that he could keep up with continuity. But he ignored it so Mjolnir could break in the sun and he could further his own story. If you think that's a little example, something to be brushed aside, I'm not finished. Jason Aaron went out of his way to make sure that Odin could never properly lift Mjolnir. Not just during his run, but in the past too. He showed him struggling with lifting the hammer, even when it was clear that he could, despite many examples to the contrary over the years, so it could fit his narrative that the enchantment had somehow gone beyond the enchanter. Odin has been handling Mjolnir with ease for his entire career. One of the most famous showings is how he handled Beta Ray Bill, who should actually be called Thor according to Jason, but moving on. How about a really serious change? And the one I'm going to focus on in this section more than the others. The origin of Mjolnir. Mjolnir already had an indisputable origin. It was explained by Oeming in Thor Disassembled, right before Thor became Rune King Thor. How did he change it? Well, apparently a super galaxy-sized god tempest once attacked Asgard, and Odin sealed it into a chunk of Uru. Okay, everyone. Mjolnir has been broken over 6 times right off the top of my head. By Molecule Man, Pericus, Loki's elite squad, by Thor blasting it to ash against Exitar, by Thor smashing it into Bor, and by the Destroyer armor once upon a time. I'm sure there's more, but that was just a simple rundown off the top of my head. Did any of you ever see a sign of Mother Storm coming out of Mjolnir? No, because Aaron pulled that out of his butt to be respectful. He took 50 years of continuity and ignored it. How does one reconcile every single time that Mjolnir was broken and no Mother Storm came out? And when it broke in the sun, because Aaron wrote himself into a corner and didn't know how to have Mangog defeated, so he had the sun kill him, Mjolnir not only broke, the storm came out instantly. Whether he likes it or not, Aaron took on a character that has a prior history, one that should have been respected. It would have been so easy to forge a different Asgardian artifact for Jane Foster. Jason Aaron did not care. He took the lore and twisted it once again to his liking. The worst change he could have made, though, was to make Mjolnir a sentient hammer. People didn't quite get my gripe with this, and it's so important. Aaron fully introduced the concept of having levels of worthiness. For instance, Odin is not as worthy as Thor, and Thor is not as worthy as Jane, so each user has an easier time wielding Mjolnir, and therefore they get better access to the weapon. This would then mean that the hammer consciously chose who it gave favor to, as Aaron did not let Odin lift it at all. So Mjolnir, despite Thor being willing to give part of his essence to repair it, go out of his way to save every realm there is, even at the cost of his multiple deaths, still did not give Thor the tools he needed to wield it without problem. Because he wasn't as worthy as top dog nurse Jane Foster. Remember, according to Aaron, Thor had never seen it move for him the way it moved for Jane. Another lie, as you can see from this scan on screen. But still, the implication is noted. Mjolnir willingly broke into pieces many times before, rather than give Thor full use of its capabilities. Mjolnir willingly smacked the hand of Thor away when he reached for it. Thor, the god who gave everything to it. Mjolnir, thanks to Jason Aaron, is a fickle piece of shit. And this stain will never go away. As other writers like that dickhead Ewing confirmed, even thousands upon thousands of years into the future, Thor still can't wield the hammer as well as Jane Foster. And Mjolnir does this consciously, refusing to allow Thor to do so. Mjolnir would rather Thor die than allow Thor to use its full capacity. And that's not an exaggeration. If you're keeping up with the series at all, you know what the words said to Thor by Nick Fury were. Gore was right. God, I can almost hear Aaron patting himself on the back. How unique, how mysterious. Guys, let me break down what those words mean and why they spell the doom of any appreciation I had for Mjolnir. What those words did was create doubt in Thor. Gore started it by pointing out the suffering that gods have caused for the mortal races. And when Nick Fury whispered that to Thor, Thor basically confirmed his doubts, as Fury had the knowledge of the Watcher in him. The hammer, now a sentient hammer, thanks to Eren, sensed that doubt in Thor and dropped like a stone. The hammer that Thor literally gave his essence for, sensed his doubt and abandoned him. That is a cold-hearted move when you realize that it was done not by a wise enchantment, but by the arbitrary spirit of a trapped feminist. So Mjolnir leaving him wasn't because Thor was any less of a hero. It left him because he was feeling traumatized by Gore, the guy who literally chained him up for months and tortured every inch of his body and mind. Eren really did it. He killed the love I had for the hammer. Moving on to more of his blunders, I want to talk about the comic book title of Thor that wasn't really about Thor for a long time. Make no mistake, Jason Aaron wrote the story of Jane Foster and put Thor as a sidelined character in his own series. The story, however, this story that received so much praise by a select community, is such garbage, guys. I'll explain why. Does it seem right to anyone that Thor Odinson didn't appear as the central figure of his own comic book for nearly 23 issues? He had 2 issues back to back where the story revolved around a story of his youth, and other than that, the story belonged to Jane Foster. That's nearly 2 years without having himself as the central figure of his own comic book. Why does Thor being unworthy equate to not being written into his own book? And the crazy thing is that this story was being treated by Eren and the select community as a bold new chapter in Thor's history. But I think we most recognized it pretty instantly if you ever kept up with Thor's history. It was Erik Masterson's story, mixed in with elements of King Thor from The Reigning, not the new old King Thor, the OG King Thor. It wasn't a new story, not even close. But I didn't mind because a lot of stories can have similarities to each other. For instance, do you guys remember that time that Erik Masterson first was granted the power of Thor? Remember how he effortlessly wielded the hammer without any hesitation in his first appearance, and that despite having no battle experience at all, as he was just an average man, he took it to creatures of mythology like they were total scrubs? Then do you remember how instead of trying to get the real Thor back, he took the hammer for himself and insisted to anyone that would listen how he was better than the real Thor? Of course you don't, because writing was better back then. This is the story of Erik Masterson becoming Thor. It was hard, and he knew he paled in comparison. Erik Masterson struggled hard to become a hero similar to Thor. He was viciously beaten and humiliated by Ulik on his first job. And it was clear that he did not know how his powers worked yet. He needed to lean on Mjolnir a lot. And when he met the real Thor, as you can see on the screen, the difference was night and day. He even admitted to being physically weaker than Thor, because there was only so much the Asgardian enchantment could do for him, versus being the genuine article. Conversely, what I just described earlier is exactly what Eren did with Jane. She basically became a master of Mjolnir within moments, and the same character who failed viciously at using Asgardian magic the first time, way in the 60s, was now a complete master of it, with Mjolnir guiding her better than it ever did Thor. She had no fear, and her doubts were quickly extinguished by how awesome she was. It took me a few months, but I slowly came to a horrifying realization that we had been fooled. This writer was not interested in telling a story of Thor. He was interested in telling the story of Jane, one that fit his narrative, and that led me to realize what Jane Foster actually was. There is a name for this, And because people will argue hard on this point, I'll even post a definition of it on screen. Jane Foster Thor is a Mary Sue. You guys can look at the definition, it's right there. She is flawless. She has no doubt beyond the first moments where she proves to be better than the thousands of years old deity who has wielded Mjolnir since he was a relative teenager. I challenge anyone to find me a defect that Jane Foster has character-wise. What did she struggle to overcome? And no, cancer isn't a character flaw. Jesus Christ, people, I can hear the typing, like furious typing starting. You won't find a single flaw in Jane Foster Thor that isn't immediately reversed by some sort of plot device that makes her feel validated. Jane Foster is a Mary Sue, and that makes her garbage. The very point from the beginning of Jane's story was that someday Mjolnir was going to kill her. With every transformation, Mjolnir purged the chemotherapy from her blood, and therefore the cancer was allowed to spread. Since day one, we knew what Jane Foster's eventual fate would be. And I'll say it was done well. It was dramatic, it was touching, and it was a kind of goodbye to a chapter in Thor's career as he entered a new phase. Then nope, she's alive. Lol, he fooled us. Consider my expectations subverted. Aaron, you crafty piece of crap. Having Jane Foster survive this ordeal absolutely invalidates any suspense that run could have had. It was no longer a bittersweet ending. It was a writer desperately jamming his character down the throats of anyone who didn't like it. She's here to stay. He even says so in the comic book. Aaron never minded doubling back on his points though. As we all know, what did Jane Foster insist to be called on the entire run? Thor. She was Thor. Love it or hate it, she was Thor, and she goes out of her way to say this. Yet at the end of her story, what does she say to Mangog? She says that the one who took him down was a mortal woman named Jane. So which is it then? Why at the end does she want to be Jane? Aaron took care of his writing all on his own, killed his own points. Am I wrong? By all means, tell me where I strayed from any objective truth. Moving on to a similar point though, Jason Aaron never actually answers the critiques given against him. He didn't answer them when I confronted him about it on Twitter, and he didn't do it in his comic books. He does, however, acknowledge the criticisms in his comic books. He's very spiteful towards criticism, and he takes it out regularly in his comic books. Here, I will show you what I mean by that. One of the biggest criticisms he received from day one was that he decided that Jane Foster should be named Thor. He was giving the name that Thor was born with to a woman. I realize that the name Thor isn't all that common anymore, especially not in the United States, but let me assure you, especially as an American of Norwegian-Danish descent, that the deity known as Thor Odinson was named Thor Odinson far before he ever picked up Mjolnir. We'll stick to comics because that's what we're talking about, but it doesn't change the point. Picking up the hammer does not make you Thor. Beta Ray Bill is not Thor. Steve Rogers is not Thor. Clark Kent is not Thor. Diana Prince, Odin Borson, Bor himself. Do I need to really say this? They're not Thor. And Jane Foster is certainly not Thor. She is a worthy user of the hammer. That's it. No more. And Jason Aaron knew this. He really did. He just doesn't answer the question. He says, yes, it is his name, and then goes on with his day. And it has to be said, and it will be said. Thor is a guy's name, people. This is literally no different than calling Jane Foster the Mighty Donald. Thor is a man's name. It's weird, it's wrong, and it doesn't come with the hammer. Only the powers of Thor, to an extent. The funny thing is, as I mentioned earlier, Aaron made sure that these words, which were shot at him early on in his series, came out only from the mouths of villains. Most famously by the Absorbing Man. A lot of fans came at him, bringing this point to the table. And for our troubles, our words were quoted by the villain as a sign that we represent something backwards and terrible. Critiquing him is terrible. You are terrible. And as recently as War of the Realms, where Eren literally took up an entire Avengers issue to show the difficulties of being She-Hulk in a world where you're loved and accepted, he actually puts the words into Ulick's mouth and has She-Hulk beat him to death with a hammer. I have no doubt that Eren sees himself as She-Hulk in that scene, and the fans who complained as Ulick. And you can see Jason not giving two craps about doing offensive stuff like this the entire series. A big critique he got against him was also how Mjolnir was destroyed in the sun. The hammer just flew into the sun and friggin' detonated. Didn't last so much as a moment. He was hassled about it on Twitter and responded with something akin to, "Well, it's the sun, of course it's hot, guys." Very snarky response. So what does he do? Well, he creates a page where not only Thor is able to better endure the sun than the hammer, but also Thor's bootleg alternate hammers made of diluted Uru are able to better withstand the sun. This is all from the same writer, guys. He freely trolls his critics and does not accept that he messes up, because he can do whatever he wants. He is the writer after all. Here's another good example. Jason Aaron was heavily critiqued for Thor's reaction to the loss of his hammer. It was too devastating. Let me remind you all what Thor said the last time he found himself without his hammer. A hammer is but a tool, even Mjolnir. Thor moved past this because despite his loss, he had people to save. He had to save his entire race from Ragnarok, so he moved past his loss like a god. Eren was critiqued for this hard, that the devastation that Thor felt over the loss of his hammer was too much. It was over-exaggerated and out of character for Thor. So what does Eren do? He makes Thor go feral in his quest for a new hammer. He does this whole Unworthy Thor series, which was actually really entertaining and reminded me why I liked Eren. The whole point of which was for Thor to pick up Ultimate Mjolnir. And guess what? Thor doesn't pick it up. Big subverting you did there, Eren. Nicely done. What a twist. The reasoning he gave for Thor not picking up the hammer was, "This is not my hammer." And I could get along with that idea. Thor wanted Mjolnir, not some replacement hammer, right? Right? Well, we were then introduced to Golden Thor, and Golden Thor has lots of hammers. In the new series after Jane Thor, he makes Thor forge dozens upon dozens of hammers to fill the void left of Mjolnir. And Thor laments his miserable existence without it. These attacks on the fans were all well-timed at the point of the time where these critiques were made. They were not accidents. Jason Aaron does not love his fans. He loves people who agree with him. How about another example? The people who complained that Jane Foster had overtaken the role of Thor and Thor was getting sidelined. So Aaron not only decided not to kill Jane Foster, but she would play a prominent role in the future series. Please understand, everyone, that Aaron made Jane Foster play a more prominent role in War of the Realms than Thor did. Jane Foster actually appears for a longer amount of time and in more issues in War of the Realms than Thor Odinson himself does. Aaron might think he likes Thor, but he likes Foster more. As a final indication of how spiteful Aaron is to criticism, Aaron was told that Jane Foster is truly nothing without the powers of Thor. She's a 135-pound woman with no special abilities or powers. She relied entirely on Mjolnir, every part of her strength. Thor Odinson does not. Even without the hammer, he's as strong as the Hulk. And he has other abilities. And he has thousands of years of experience, and he's a royal prince. So Aaron writes some of the most ridiculous scenes I've ever seen in comics. Jane Foster, a recently cured cancer patient, actually picks up a broadsword and strikes down creatures of mythology with it. Then she picks up Gungnir and stabs the Minotaur with it, a Hulk-level opponent. She should have been killed instantly, but you see, this circus that Eren created does not allow such things. Now we know that Foster is quite the woman without the hammer. It's so obvious and intentional. I really hope that the pattern is clear to everyone. Eren is spiteful and he is petty, especially towards anyone who disagrees with him. So we're nearing the end of the video, and I want my final point to be one about the term character development and some related terms to that. A large portion of Eren's violent fans, as well as himself, brushed aside the damage done to Thor in the name of quote-unquote character development. I will provide the definition so people can't argue about it. What more depth were people looking for in Thor? Look, starting with Thor Disassembled, Thor lost his entire race. He had to pluck out his own eyes to gain the knowledge that he had to lead his people to die in order to end the cycle of cosmic god demons feeding on the rebirth and death of his people. Then he comes back and is a lone god on Earth who has to find his entire people and revive them from mortal forms, the effort of which nearly killed him. He is banished from Asgard for killing his grandfather under the spell of Loki, which shakes him deeply to his core, and he broke his hammer, leaving him in a very vulnerable state for a while. Thor then has his people experimented on him by Dr. Doom, vivisected while he was unable to defend them. Asgard comes crashing down around him in siege as it's ripped apart by Sentry, who he then has to execute. And it goes on from there, guys. What more adversity do you want? Thor's been exiled, homeless, depressed, broken all over the course of a few years, not to mention the horrific things he endured at the hands of Gore. Yet fans still cling to this idea of all in the name of character development. He had to learn humility. What possible lessons could Thor learn about humility when Thor already gouged out his eyes in exchange for the knowledge of the will of Mimir? Thor already made the sacrifices above and beyond any Allfather. When Thor was reborn, he was reborn as a king. He was slowly regressed to his older/younger self because it was difficult to write such a regal character. But that should not be confused with Thor having to learn any lessons of this manner. It's lazy writing, and it stomps on the legacy of a character like Thor. Yes, writing new and innovative ideas for Thor is difficult. Why should that be easy? He's a flagship character of Marvel, Marvel Earth's best defender and an original Avenger. He's supposed to be difficult. Jason Aaron took his development and actually committed character regression. But here's the tricky part to understand. I'm sure some are familiar with the concept of falsifiability. One of the best examples for this is the example of the doctor who has to saw off the legs of his patients. Basically, the scenario, which is created to expose absurdity, poses a doctor who cuts off the legs of infected patients. If the patient dies, then he was beyond saving. If he lives, it was because of the treatment of the doctor. Notice that there's no option C. It's the same with Jason Aaron. If people like his writing, it's because they're woke. If they don't like his writing, it's because they're not. There's no option C, which might mean because you suck. And that is an absurdity. By definition, by scientific definition, he has committed an absurdity with this series. Some of my final sentiments on this video, just to wrap things up in a nice crap-covered bow, is that Thor suffered some of the most humiliating and excruciating moments of any character in all of fiction. There were rape undertones in the way Gore tortured Thor. Eren had angels go full cartel on Thor and pull out his teeth, psychologically attack him, strip him naked and beat him. Thor lost his arm to a B-rate Thor villain. Don't even try to argue that point. Malekith was never the bane of Asgard and never a threat to the realms as a whole the way he was written before. He had Thor mope as an incoherent drunk for months canonically and years in real time. Thor lost his pride. He lost his powers for a time. Eren stripped him of his massive physical strength. He destroyed his relationship with his father. He put Thor at the bottom of the barrel and then dug a hole and put him down deeper. So when I hear people say, hey, he got his hammer back, things are back to normal. No, they're not. They will never be normal again. The damage cannot be erased. Thor's reputation, his history, his physical integrity are all permanently damaged. All in the name of an agenda to spite the all fans who complained about it. And people wonder why I'm bitter. Could any of you imagine what would happen if this happened to Superman? Or Batman? Or, as ridiculous to even think this, Wonder Woman? Captain America? Iron Man? It would be cruel and unusual. But it didn't happen to them. It happened to Thor, and I guess that makes it okay. I want to ask everyone watching this, what is the point of making a female Thor as a form of female empowerment when you have her using the name of a man? Because she needed a man's name to be relevant? That's not empowerment. That's backtracking and offensive to women. Or at least I would feel offended. I know there's a lot of people out there who eat this stuff up. And now we all get to see everyone smile smugly at each other on the big screen. The only comfort I had in all of this was at least the comic book community is a limited community. We're small in number compared to the movie community. There were a lot of people who didn't even know about this, but come 2021, everyone will know that Jane Foster is the #1 Thor, and Thor is a second-rate hero. And new generations will grow and watch our hero be permanently tainted. Sorry for such a depressing video, guys, but it had to be done. I'm not going anywhere though. We'll fight this together. See you for more videos on the subject and some more cheery ones that we can actually enjoy together. Please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. I love reading your comments. I love you guys. Even the ones that critique me because I'm not Jason Aaron and I'm not going to write you as the villains of this story. We will keep in touch. Fernando out. It's like 2 in the morning. I'm done. Good night, everyone. Bye.